Imagine going to a Halloween party, thinking it's just a night of costumes, laughter, and spooky decorations. But when loud bangs echo from downstairs, everything changes. Friends hiding in terror, strangers breaking in. A night that turns into a nightmare no one can ever forget. This isn't your typical Halloween horror story. It's real. The chaos, the haunting aftermath, the secrets that unravel each year as Halloween rolls around again. Want to hear the full story? Make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the details of this terrifying night and more chilling stories just like it. Let's dive into the dark side of Halloween. It was Halloween night back in 2012, and I was 22, excited to join the annual Halloween party at my best friend Nick's house. Nick, always a Halloween fanatic, would spend a small fortune on decorations and props, transforming his parents' empty house into a full-scale haunted maze. His parents were out of town every Halloween, so Nick went all out, covering the house in terrifying props and even building cardboard walls with creepy wallpaper to create a haunted maze that spanned almost every room. The party was in full swing, with people in costumes packed wall to wall. The night started out as you'd expect, music blaring, everyone dancing and having a good time. But sometime past midnight, things took a dark turn. I was upstairs with Nick, Vinny, Joey, and Q. We were huddled in Nick's bedroom, taking turns at the bong and laughing at ridiculous things. But then we heard it. 2 loud bangs from downstairs. It was clear and unmistakable, even with the music blasting. We all froze. Nick jumped up, his face pale, and opened the door just a crack to look down the hall. "What's going on?" I asked. But before Nick could answer, we heard blood-curdling screams from downstairs. A mixture of men and women yelling, some begging. That was when Nick slammed the door shut, locking it. "Get down! Hide!" he whispered urgently. Even though we were under the influence, we knew something was terribly wrong. The music abruptly cut off, replaced by the sound of a man yelling, telling everyone to shut up. There was a moment of dead silence, broken by another bang, then more screaming. None of us needed an explanation. We each scrambled to hide wherever we could. Nick dove into the closet with Joey, Vinny squeezed himself into a storage box, and I found a spot under the bed with Q. The room fell into tense silence as we tried to make ourselves invisible, holding our breaths. After a few minutes, we heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. They were slow and deliberate. Whoever was coming up didn't care about being quiet. They wanted us to hear. I could just barely see through the slit under the bed. A man in black boots and torn jeans was standing outside the bedroom door. He tried the doorknob, and when it didn't budge, he started throwing himself against the door, trying to break in. After a few failed attempts, the sound of gunshots rang out, shattering the lock. The door flew open and he walked in. I felt a wave of terror like nothing I'd ever experienced, watching his boots move around the room. I could hear Nick whispering from the closet, begging them not to kill him, offering them money, anything to let him live. But they ignored him, dragging him downstairs as he identified himself as the owner of the house. I felt a painful lump of guilt in my throat, knowing he was trying to protect the rest of us. The rest of us stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe. For what felt like hours, we could hear muffled voices, then silence. Finally, the front door slammed shut, and footsteps approached the stairs again. But this time it was Nick. He opened the door and motioned for us to come out. "It's over. They're gone," he said, looking shell-shocked. When we went downstairs, I immediately wished I hadn't. 2 of our friends, Jen and Robbie, lay lifeless on the floor. Blood pooled beneath their bodies, staining the hardwood. We were frozen in horror, standing there in silence as reality set in. The police eventually came, questioning each of us, trying to understand what had happened. We were still so shaken that it felt like a dream, or rather, a nightmare we couldn't wake from. They took down our statements, but there was little they could do at that moment. As shaken as we all were, Nick took it the hardest. Over the next few months, he started isolating himself, slipping into a spiral of guilt and depression. He told me once that he couldn't forgive himself for throwing that party, that he felt responsible for the deaths of Jen and Robbie. Eventually, he started using harder drugs, trying to numb the pain. In July of 2013, Nick passed away from a heroin overdose. It shattered me, knowing that he'd never escaped the nightmare of that Halloween night. Fast forward to Halloween 2013. It was my first one alone in my new place, a small house on a quiet street. I was still haunted by memories of Nick and that night. Around 11 p.m., I was on my couch watching horror movies when I heard a knock at the door. Trick-or-treaters, I thought, though it was late. I ignored it, assuming they'd leave, but the knocking came again, louder. Irritated, I got up and opened the door, only to find nobody there. I looked up and down the street, but there was no one in sight. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just some Halloween prank. I went back inside, double-locked the door, and sat down, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But then, the knocking started again, this time on my bedroom door. My heart stopped, and my skin prickled with fear. I froze, barely daring to breathe, trying to tell myself it had to be some Halloween trick. I grabbed my phone and opened a gunshot sound effect video, blasting it through my speakers. "This is a warning shot!" I yelled, praying it would scare them off. I waited, listening. After a long silence, I finally heard footsteps leaving, fading into the night. I peered out of my room cautiously, but no one was there. The next morning, I found my front door wide open. I knew I hadn't forgotten to lock it. Someone had definitely been inside. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in broad daylight. The following Halloween, I stayed home, handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. By then, the events with Nick were a haunting memory, something I tried to put out of my mind. At one point, the phone rang. I picked up, expecting my mom, but there was silence on the other end, just faint breathing. I hung up, unsettled. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. The same silence, the same heavy breathing. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was probably just some Halloween prank, but my stomach knotted with fear. The third time it rang, I picked up, bracing myself. "I'm coming to visit you tonight," a voice said, low and menacing. I slammed the phone down, too scared to think clearly. A few moments later, the lights in my house flickered, then went out completely. My house was engulfed in darkness. I grabbed my phone, but it was useless without power. Then I heard banging on the front door, loud and relentless. I was too terrified to move, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like hours, the banging finally stopped, and the lights came back on. I opened the door, half expecting to find someone waiting, but all I saw was an empty porch. That Halloween still haunts me to this day. Every October, I can't help but remember Nick, that terrifying night at his party, and the way I felt alone in my house with someone, or something, out there in the dark. Whether it was a Halloween prank or something more sinister, I don't know. But I do know I'll never feel completely safe on Halloween again.